Well, I mean, I obviously think the fact that we have the bill is welcome, as indeed are many of its provisions. But I mean, in the limited time that we have, I suppose I'd like to concentrate on the number of significant omissions and gaps that are there in the bill, which is supposed to transpose the Victims Directive into Irish law, but actually excludes some of its most crucial ingredients. And I think, as other deputies have made the points, I think the issue of special measures for victims, the whole issue of restorative justice, the definition of who is a victim of crime, and complaints by victims, the bill is lacking on all of those fronts, in that it doesn't fully transpose the directive and leaves us open to infringement proceedings brought by the EU Commission. Now, yesterday we were privileged to have a very excellent presentation at the Justice Committee by Maria MacDonald of the Victims' Rights Alliance, and she cited the shocking figures that 72% of the victims of crime feel re-victimised by the criminal justice system. Absolutely shocking, particularly when compared to the fact that 49% of them feel re-victimised by the accused. So they're more oppressed actually by the state and our criminal justice system than they are by the offender. And we've seen countless examples of the harm being done to victims of crime in the litany of reports that we have: Gearan, O'Higgins, the 2014 Garda Inspectorate report, the Victims' Rights Alliance report on the implementation and enforcement on the directive, and so on. And all of them categorically state the wrongs done to victims in Ireland, particularly around issues like the failure by Gardaí to record crimes, the failure to provide information to victims, cases of victims finding out about the outcome of a case involving them either through the media or through the grapevine. Really appalling treatment by people who have already been victimised. I think the O'Higgins report in particular was incredibly stark about victims being let down by the Gardaí, and it's interesting that the Minister at the time of the publication talked about the findings being unacceptable, disheartening, that we must all take measures open to us to ensure that these shortcomings are not repeated. But I mean, they are being repeated. And we'd be all very naive to think that the necessary reform that's there has been delivered, because it hasn't been. And I mean, I raised a number of the cases earlier at leaders' questions about people who have been the appalling victims of crime and have been re-victimised by the treatment they got when they turned to the Gardaí to get help in having those crimes investigated. So if we don't deal with the issues of the urgent need for Garda reform on the one hand, then it will be a lopsided position, and we won't get the type of appropriate treatment for victims that they deserve. Now, just in terms of the bill's provisions itself, I mean, I think the issues around not including restorative justice from the point of view of the fact that the victim should be informed on first contact with the Gardaí of the available restorative justice services, and secondly in Article 12 that where restorative justice services are available, safeguards must be put in place to protect against repeat victimisation, to ensure that victims have access to safe and competent restorative justice systems, and to ensure that they are put forward in the best interests of the victim. Now, all of this should have been provided for in the bill, because this is an incredibly empowering and important provision, not only in terms of empowering the victim to confront their perpetrator in the appropriate surroundings, but it can have a profound effect on the offender as well, in making that person understand the damage of the offence that they have caused. And ultimately, if we get that right and implement it properly, actually we're going to have less victims, and that's what we really need to be getting to. And I mean, I think the point that was made that these services aren't available on a nationwide basis isn't really a good enough excuse, or that they're not on a statutory basis, because we do know that members of the judiciary have put forward recommendations, in fairness a very unsuitable one which was cited at the Justice Committee yesterday, where a judge in the case of a victim of a child sex abuse case was asked to engage in the restorative justice system with a perpetrator who had not accepted the facts of the case, who had rejected the guilty verdict, and clearly was somebody who hadn't acknowledged the damage of what he had done, and asking the victim to engage in that process was just incredibly wrong, inappropriate and harmful, and that's not the goal of restorative justice. And how the process is set up is very, very important, but I think we need to put more resources on that. I think the other area of the problematic definition of the victim that has been highlighted by other deputies. I mean, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission have made the point that the bill should be amended to broaden the definition of a victim. We agree with that. Doing so would ensure that the services for victims provided for in it would not be dependent on the victim making a formal complaint or an offender being prosecuted or convicted. And this is in line with the Victims Directive, which requires states to ensure that access to support services are facilitated at the earliest point following a crime, and that access is not dependent on a formal complaint. And I think the tight definition in this bill is actually a significant failing, which will have to be addressed at a later stage, and that's particularly pertinent in the areas of domestic violence. We know from the 2014 Garda Inspectorate report the litany of the manner in which victims had been treated. Gardaí called out, being told, Asher, look, there's two of them in it, or just don't annoy him and he won't come back, or the really shocking example where Gardaí answered an emergency call to a home where a woman was being threatened by her husband, and one of the Gardaí said to the woman, well, sure, look, we've enough to be doing now, the next time we won't call back. And of course later that day the husband returned home, stabbed his wife in front of their child, who was also injured in protecting his mother. Both victims were taken to hospital, and it took 3 days to get a statement from that woman. And obviously, broadening this bill to take in victims like that woman and her child would have a profound effect on Gardaí in cases like hers, and it would highlight and intensify their obligations and would work to ensure that such catastrophic errors would not be repeated. So I think it's really important that we would look at that. I mean, we know that victims of domestic and sexual violence in particular are very hesitant to make a complaint, and the Inspectorate actually in their many reports provided several examples of where an investigating Garda was directed by a district officer to put pressure on victims to make up their minds about whether they wanted to make a complaint, which is absolutely inappropriate. And I think if victims had access to support and services to protect them, that would protect them from pressure from Gardaí and would support them in their decision as to whether or not they want to formally complain. And I think the Victims Directive itself talks about indirect victims of crime, for example, children who witness domestic violence, and they absolutely should have the same access to support services. I think the other particular areas, obviously, Garda training and increased funding, absolutely necessary if it's going to be meaningful. More funding and more resources are necessary. I mean, the evidence given yesterday at the committee that clicking on the link of the victim support services on the Garda website links you into a defunct Commission of Victims of Crime services is just wholly unacceptable in this day and age. We know that 64% of victims saying they weren't informed by the Gardaí about victim support services. So resourcing has to be addressed in that regard. I think as well, critically, the area of training for the judiciary. We know Article 25 of the Directive provides that officials likely to come into contact with victims should get specialist and general training appropriate to their level of contact with the victims of crime in order to enable with the situation appropriately. And I mean, I know there are plans to develop training for lawyers and so on, but this absolutely should be extended and must be actually to the judiciary itself. I think the other final point of a gap, I suppose, is section 16, which deals with special measures for very vulnerable victims, and it says that these may be used, but the directive says they shall be used. And I mean, these supports are things like, a victim to be interviewed by somebody of the same sex in a sexual violence case and so on. There's many good reasons why these should be mandatory and limited only by overall consideration. So, I mean, the last point, Chair, is really, I think, to support the call made by the Rape Crisis Network and the Victims' Rights Alliance for the establishment of a Victims' Ombudsman Ombudsman as a central point of contact for dealing with complaints. As it stands, the bill provides for information to be given on how to complain to the Gardaí, GSOC and the DPP, but these organisations would not be fit for purpose in this regard, and I think an Ombudsman office would be far preferable.